Andrew and Bill, how you guys doing?
Doing great. How are you, Travis?
Doing good, man.
Great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you guys too. I mean, we got to start off. Where are you guys at right now? This background behind you guys is crazy.
We are in what we call the Wolf Den, and we this is like our studio where we're doing live broadcast and Facebooking and all that good stuff. And it's got all. If you were here, I'm Bill Wolf Driver Helman, and technically speaking, I call myself a dog adventurer. So I run all over the East Coast of the United States with my dogs on bike-like sleds. And this studio kind of commemorates that. It's got all kinds of decor to do with that and to do with dogs and all that good stuff.
Right. Man, so Wolf Driver, that's not a given name.
It's not a birth given name, but it's a dog given name.
Yeah, right on. No, it looks awesome. I love all this stuff. It's great for anyone who is just listening. I encourage you to hop on the on YouTube. Sweet. Look great. Oh man. Okay, well you guys are I mean, would it be fair to say I'm talking to the two of the best experts on presidential pets?
I would say it's pretty close.
Maybe one and a half. Andrew's the real expert. I'm getting there.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of people out there who aren't connected to the museum who are sort of like amateur experts. Like you'd be surprised. There's a lot of niche interest in the presidential pet thing. So I'm sure there are a lot of people out there whose knowledge rivals mine or possibly even surpasses mine, but they just weren't in the right place at the right time, I guess, when Bill took over the museum. So
Yeah. Yeah, so let's start there. How did this begin? Why the Presidential Pet Museum and how?
the museum was started by a woman named Claire McLean, and she was one of Ronald Reagan's dog groomers. What was
Oh,
it? Was it Bouvier's?
I think they were Bouvier's. And
Yeah.
her dog, was it Lucky?
Yeah, it was the Reagan's dog Lucky that she was grooming, and she decided to, I don't know, smuggle out some dog hair from the White House. And I mean, maybe that's totally allowed. I don't know. But she got it home, and either she or her mother, one of them made, maybe both, made mixed media art from the dog hair. And they got interested in presidential pets, and Claire started this museum. I believe it was around 20 or 25 years ago.
Yeah, something
And
along those lines.
she ran it for a number of years, and but she was sort of getting on in age, and she wasn't able to sort of promote it the way she had been, and she didn't want it to die, so she was looking for someone to take it over, and that's where Bill came in. And I guess, Bill, you should probably give him some of your history, like why you got interested in presidential pets or why you came to this project.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. Well, through all my dog adventuring, we go on a lot of trails. Again, I'm on the East Coast of the United States, and a lot of history here, Civil War, etc. And I took a good interest to that, and especially some of the bigger parks and trails, like the CNO, which stands for Chesapeake and Ohio Canal and Towpath, is one of the largest trails around here. It goes almost 200 miles. And I was interested in finding out the history of it because you pass by all these remnants of buildings and it says Civil War, so and so crossed here. Really interesting stuff. So then I learned that one of the presidents designated that trail as a park, as the whole thing, because the canal went defunct soon after it was completed, somewhere in the 1800s. And
Hmm.
I started thinking about history and everything and how it plays a part in what people do. They get out there with their dogs and doing this and tying that together with the presidents having pets. And I'm like, do you know which president designated? I can't remember if it was Roosevelt or
Yeah, I want to say it was around that time. I did some research on the CNO, but it's been over a year and I haven't followed up on that.
but I just was taking it. Why would a president, go out of his way to designate a state park? Like, what's the interest? And then I'm thinking about it. Maybe he takes his dog out. Maybe he does things with his dogs. I mean, they got to get away from politics. They got to get a stress release, whatever. And
Mhm.
just in that time frame, Claire came along. Somewhere I had noticed that she had to do something with the museum, rehome it. And I contacted her and some of the people she works with, and we were able to work it out. She liked what I do, and she liked the fact that I was able to bring people on board like Andrew. And she said, I think you're the natural next home for the Presidential Pet Museum. And
uh-huh.
history from there.
Yeah. Man, that's so cool. Yeah, you guys kind of have it's just kind of a natural progression of how that happened, and you were right there to take it over. So I got to ask about your, what is that trail for Wolf Drive? What's the proper term,
Okay, the trail it's basically a nature trail that's for
Uh-huh.
hiking and pedestrians and biking. It crosses some roads. It starts off in Washington D.C. and Georgetown,
Hmm.
so it's a crowded area, well-populated area. And if you go down there, you'll see tons of people. But it goes all the way out to Cumberland, Maryland, and through there, you're passing through a lot of remote areas that it's almost isolated. I mean, you can get back there and be on stretches for 15 miles plus and not see any roads or any way to access it. So you're
Hmm.
way back there. And there's things back there besides the war remnants. There's like a cement factory that was really interesting because the kilns are still there. And there were kilns before that factory even that were, I don't know if they were making ammo, what they were making, but they're like buried inside the woods there and you just discover them. We've actually, to go one step further, we've done some ghost hunting there because we were so inspired, and some of what transpired on the trail, I guess, kind of motivated us or piqued my interest at least. And I'm like, I wonder what else happens here. And there's not that much information available on the internet about it. Of course, Andrew has done some research on that trail, and he found some of the backstory. But there's, of course, it's almost 200 miles. There's a lot of stories along there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And actually, tying it to presidential pets, I don't know if Jackie Kennedy walked her dogs there, but I believe she used to walk along the C&O in Georgetown. That was one of the things when I was researching our book about their dog Pushinka. I found that she would walk along the C&O Canal. So there's a connection for you.
Wow, yeah. And then the Kennedys, you see bringing up Jackie Kennedy. I mean, they had horses at the White House and some pretty famous ones.
Uh-huh.
And that blew my mind. Like when I was getting involved with the Presidential Pet Museum, some of the animals that were at the White House was really incredible. I mean, it was just like you would never expect it.
Yeah,
Well,
really.
I think the thing is, in the last 50 years or so, basically from Lyndon Johnson onward, most of the animals have been dogs and cats.
Hmm.
I don't even know if anybody's had any birds since then. I don't think so. But if you go back farther, back into the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge had all kinds of crazy stuff. My favorite being Rebecca the raccoon, who was sent to him as a Thanksgiving dinner. Somebody sent him a live raccoon. I guess because it would spoil. But he decided, I'm not going to eat this raccoon for Thanksgiving because I'd rather have a turkey. But
They could have put some feathers on it.
yeah. He kept it as a pet, and his wife used to walk the raccoon on a leash, and they took it to the White House Easter egg roll, but apparently it got a little out of hand there and tore somebody's dress and had to be taken away. Go figure, like the raccoon, like and a bunch of kids, and it's not a great mix.
Probably not.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine now if a president, Donald Trump doesn't have any pets, but let's say he got a raccoon, like what kind of news that would make.
Yeah. Now, was that like, because yeah, I've, me growing up and seeing the presidents is always like their dogs or cats, just normal kind of, domesticated animals that people have. But was that kind of a sign of the times? Did other people in the general population have raccoons? Do you know?
I don't know about pet raccoons, but I do know that just animals, I mean, they didn't have the city ordinances in the same way that we do now, where you're really restricted on what you're allowed in certain municipalities. I mean, Herbert Hoover's son had alligators. They weren't at the White House. This was before Hoover became president, but he lived in D.C. and he had alligators in his townhome. And it was just that kind of thing. Like I've read stories about people in the 40s and 50s who would go door to door selling pet monkeys to people.
Oh my gosh.
No, none actually made their way to the White House, but it was just one of those times where there was the availability of exotic animals and people were more willing to experiment with that. I don't think there was the same awareness about animal cruelty or about, what's best for your monkey. That we would have now. I mean, now there would be a lot of issues. There still are people with weird pets. Like I remember a woman maybe 10 years ago got her face ripped off by a chimpanzee.
Yeah.
That was her pet chimp. but that's much more rare now, and probably in part because we have the internet and we can see stories like woman gets face ripped off by chimpanzee, and that's a deterrent.
True.
Yeah.
There has been a shift over time in the way people perceive the animals just in general. Like if you go back far enough, George Washington had dogs and horses and things like that, and we call them pets on our website. But in all honesty, they're more like working animals. You know, these are hunting dogs. These are hounds. These are horses that he's riding or that are pulling his carriage. It's very different from, Richard Nixon having a dog sitting next to him watching TV at night. It's just a very different view of an animal's role in a human's life, really. And that's been something that I hadn't really thought about before I became historian at the museum. But you can sort of see a shift over time in how these animals are perceived and what their use is. I mean, a lot of our modern presidential pets are in some ways a public relations tool.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, not that people don't love them, not that George W. Bush didn't love Barney or that Barack Obama didn't love Bo or anything like that. I'm sure that these people love their pets, but those pets are useful for humanizing you and for making you seem relatable to the average person in a way that Thomas Jefferson wasn't thinking about when he was buying mockingbirds, So
Yeah, I think that's the thing too about why people kind of enjoy that aspect of seeing what the presidential pet is. It's just a kind of a glimpse into more of their personal life and saying, they just live in this house. They have pets,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You can really see that personal side of them, which I think people find interesting, and everyone loves dogs too,
Oh yeah. I mean, what are the statistics now? I think I saw somewhere like 60% of American homes have dogs.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, it's something high like that.
It's huge.
That's
and
incredible.
Of course, a multi-billion-dollar industry for supplies and food for them and all that good stuff.
Yeah. But, I did another interview with somebody, and the lady asked me, looking at the presidential candidates that are out there right now, obviously Donald Trump doesn't have any animals, and there are a couple of the Democratic contenders who don't have any pets. Bernie Sanders doesn't have one. I don't think Kamala Harris has a pet. But this lady said to me, well, do you think that having a pet or the type of pet that someone has would change a vote? And, maybe not in a Republican versus Democrat competition, but if you were looking at it from a primary standpoint, if you're somebody who's a Democratic voter and you're looking at 4 or 5 candidates that have very similar views and, their policies are reasonably comparable and like their personality, the pet might come in handy, or it might be an edge. Like maybe you say, well, Pete Buttigieg has some rescue pugs, and I like that he rescued his dogs. Or, Elizabeth Warren has a golden retriever. I have a golden retriever. I mean, it could be just something that pushes somebody a little bit over the top. I mean, I don't know. You never know what's going to make the average person push a button in a voting booth. So,
yeah, that's a very good point.
Consideration.
I think animal lovers like other animal lovers or other people with dogs that are similar to them. And when you add the whole element of rescuing and everything else, that's why I think he has a more appeal along to people like that. Mm-hmm. So I think, like you're saying, Democrat, Republican, it might not have sway a voter too much. Yeah. But when you start in primaries, it might have some impact.
You do see some confirmation bias with stuff too. I mean, we try not to get very political at the Presidential Pet Museum because our thought is that pets are something that unite us as a people. But when you tell people that Donald Trump doesn't have any pets, people who don't like Donald Trump, I mean, to them, that's like this, of course he doesn't have pets. He's a terrible person. Those animals would suffer. Like there's this very visceral reaction that people have to that. Which, like I said, is confirmation bias, of course, the things I've always believed are true because this. And I'm sure it goes the other way, way too.
When he first got elected, actually, we had people contacting us. In fact, I took a couple of the calls. They wanted to give a dog to him, a Labradoodle, I remember in particular, and they wanted to know if we had any sources that could help us get into the White House and rehome, or it was a puppy actually, a Labradoodle, to Donald Trump.
Oh my gosh!
And
wow.
The answer is no. We have no sources. We are not juiced in.
But on that being said, the White House on at least one occasion before we took the museum over had given Claire, the founder of the museum again, the cowbell, I believe, from the last cow that roamed the lawns, grazed on the lawns of the White House, which was Pauline.
Pauline Wayne was William Howard Taft's cow, but I didn't know that came from the White House.
That came from the White House.
Oh, okay, well,
that's
see,
the story.
That's
the story Claire told me, that the White House contacted them, and for some reason they needed to get rid of the cowbell or give it away.
It was taking up 6 inches of space on a shelf.
And they said, you're in the natural place we want it to be. So
yeah, that's perfect.
That's actually one of my favorite artifacts. It's great because you can take that out to different like shows and conventions, and people can touch it and hold it, and it's this 110-year-old cowbell. But it's a part of history that they can't really damage. It's not like
they could drop it. I mean, the cow did what it did with it, so the cow couldn't hurt it.
Yeah. Well, there's another example of how animals have changed over time. I mean, now you would never think about having a cow in downtown DC, but at that time they didn't have milk delivery and you didn't have grocery stores. So if you wanted milk with your breakfast or any kind of dinner, you had to have a cow on the property. And so cows were just roaming around there for all those years.
And maybe it was doing the job of the lawnmower too.
Yeah, well, that gets us into Woodrow Wilson and his sheep, right? In World War I,
one of his favorites.
Oh yeah. I love the story of Old Ike. Old Ike was Woodrow Wilson's ram. During World War I, Woodrow Wilson sent his gardeners off to the war effort, and it was sort of like, I'm making a sacrifice, and look, I'm going to bring in these sheep to mow the lawn at the White House, and then we'll auction off their wool and donate that to the Red Cross. And so you had all these sheep, and then there was one ram there, and that was Old Ike, and he was cantankerous. And people at the time, like reporters or whoever was at the White House, would just throw their cigar butts on the ground, and the ram got addicted to chewing tobacco. Like it started chewing the cigars, and so like funny. Yeah, even to the end of its life, like the guy who it was rehomed to after Woodrow Wilson left office. That guy would feed Ike cigars like a couple times a day. And if you were walking around with tobacco and you didn't share, the ram would nudge you, and he would get more and more aggressive if you did not share with him. So, I wrote a children's book about that, which is a weird topic for a children's book. Like you try to go into an elementary school and you're reading this book about a ram who chews tobacco. Might have sold better in, like 30, 40 years ago. Maybe we could take it somewhere like North Carolina, a place where the tobacco industry is strong. Yeah.
Man, yeah, that's a really fun story. I love stuff like that where, they just had to have animals around for practical purposes. And, we don't really think about that anymore where we have our milk delivered to us and stuff. We don't need cows on our front lawn. But, it's a very, very good point.
Yeah, we're so disconnected from our food chain at this point, or most of us, unless you live on a farm or you do a lot of hunting or, you have your own garden. The rest of us, it's like everything comes prepackaged, wrapped in plastic, and it's a very different mindset, and it's not anything like it was even like 60 years ago. So it's a lot of stories like this. It's a way of kind of reconnecting with not just the trivia and the facts and the dates, like, okay, World War I happened here to here, but how were people actually living at that time? And I think that's the part that a lot of times when you just read a history textbook or something, you don't get that vibe. Or you watch a movie and they kind of cover the main events, like here's the battle and here's how they won, but you don't get the vibe of like what it was like to just be a normal person in those days. And I think the museum allows us to get through some of that.
Mm-hmm. I like the areas when I talk about the trails, when I get somewhere that's steeped in history, like the CNO, sometimes it's cool to just stop for a couple minutes, close my eyes, and the places, again, that are remote, you don't hear any cars or planes or anything, and you're just like, what was it like to be here 150 years ago? I mean, you just imagine what people were going through then. And a lot of that canal was hand dug, if not all of it. So you're like, wow. This place must have been unbelievable.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is truly extraordinary to go visit, be in an actual historical place where something was happening, even hundreds or thousands of years ago, and you can see the remains. And yeah, to just take a minute and try to picture it and feel what was going on. It is really, really cool.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's a reminder of just how fortunate we are to have been born when we were born. You look and see like, oh man, life must have sucked back then.
Yeah,
Digging a canal by hand, for example, would really suck.
I
that'd be
can't even
rough.
imagine. If you see this place, I mean, it's just like, how in the world could they dig it by hand? I mean, it'd be hard enough with equipment, with bulldozers and backhoes, but I mean,
Well,
wow.
didn't you say there's a tunnel on the C&O Canal where they thought it would take them like a year to dig through this mountain, and it took them 10 years
Yeah.
because it was before dynamite and
The
before,
the Paul, it's called coincidentally, I thought it was some kind of joke on me
Uh-huh.
because a friend of mine set out, hey, we're going to go explore the Paw Paw Tunnel with the dogs today, and I'm like, knock it off, Paw Paw Tunnel, dogs, and it actually is in a place, or it goes near a place called Paw Paw, West Virginia. It's a tunnel, or a mountain, I should say, that when they were building the canal, it was one of the hardest parts they had to make it around. And there were
Mhm.
different stories. They could go around the mountain, they could run the canal, and they could do this, that, and the other. But they had to deal with this mountain in some way. So somebody came up with a plan to, I guess, I don't know if they had dynamite back
I
then.
don't think they did. No, that was later.
Somehow they had to get through this tunnel. And they said it's going to take a year.
Hmm.
That's the plan they came up with. Well, it took 14 years, actually, from
Okay.
my understanding. And in that 14 years, the canal was still getting built, but the railroad moved in there, and the railroad pretty much put them out of business. So they
Oh
made it
man.
through the tunnel, and I've been through the tunnel. It's like 5/8 of a mile, and it's really eerie in there because the canal, I've never seen anything like it. In fact, the canal actually runs through it to this day. Now it's just a dilapidated waterway that when it rains, it fills up and it passes through there. And there's like almost a skeleton type, I guess, barrier or fence that keeps you from falling in. My dogs were so freaked out. The dogs that were on that side, because we're surrounded. On one side's a wall, on the other side's a fence. The sides that the fence that this dilapidated, well, the fence is not in bad shape. It's just real open the way it's built. The dogs were like, oh, they could sense that they could fall over there. Now there's probably no
Oh.
way they fall. They're tethered to the bike. But I mean, if you slip a little bit, things can happen. And I had to move them, so I had 4 dogs on one side of the bike. It was pretty interesting, dynamic. But what was even more fun was when we went through at night. We decided we're going to ghost hunt this tunnel because there's all
Yeah.
kinds of stories back there. They claim they have something that says only in your state. They claim it's one of the most haunted tunnels in Maryland or in the East Coast, whatever. We didn't get a lot of paranormal activity that we detected, but it was eerie in there. That's for sure.
Oh, yeah.
And I have to jump in here with the talk of ghost hunting and say that I'm very skeptical about. I don't go on most of these ghost hunts, although I'm willing to travel
But
along.
he has gone with us before.
I did go once, yes, and it was an interesting, almost like an anthropological thing. Like I'm watching, like, oh, so this is what a ghost hunt is, because I've never watched Ghost Adventurers or whatever those shows are. But it's just the more you get to know Bill, the more there are these layers of the onion that peel back, and there's just like one more layer of weirdness there that you're like, oh, there's that too, and it's all very like charming and lovable weirdness, Bill.
Thank you.
You're
That's
not
what he says
creepy.
now.
Yeah, that's what I say on microphone.
creepy.
The next
Yeah.
part of the onion you peel back, you might say I'm creepy.
Oh my gosh! Wow. Well, I mean, yeah, just jumping back to that, well, they didn't have dynamite, but it's like I went to a kind of a history of medicine, a pharmaceutical museum kind of thing, pharmacy museum, and we were getting a tour, and the tour guide said that, back in the 1800s, early 1900s, they didn't have anything to numb the pain or anything like that, and people would get amputated and just bite on a piece of wood and
Oh my gosh.
drink some alcohol and go for it, and everyone's like, oh yeah, like just clear, like it sounds horrible, but he's like, you got to realize that's just what it was back then. People didn't think that there was even a way to take away the pain, like that's just what life was, and that's just what you had to deal with when you had to get your arm amputated.
I read a really interesting book on James Garfield called The Destiny of the Republic, and it was about his assassination. And really, a lot of it came down to the fact that Americans didn't understand germ theory at the time. There was this germ theory had started to be developed in Europe, and American doctors were like, oh, that's bullshit. Like, there's no such thing as a germ, And, he had this bullet in him, and he would have lived, except that every day they would, like, get a metal stick out and poke around in there to try and dig this bullet out. And like they didn't wash or sanitize this metal stick.
Right.
And the poor guy, like it's saying like he was so brave, like he never screamed or anything, but they're not anesthetizing him. They're not putting anything on that. They're just like taking his bullet hole and shoving a metal stick in there and then moving it around looking for a bullet. And, eventually he just got infected and died from that. And, it was probably a relief, honestly, after like he lived for, I think he was shot in like June and he died in September or October. I mean, he lived for several months getting poked and prodded every day with this bullet in him and like infection growing. So
Wow.
it was yeah. And it's a shame too, because, when you actually look at his policies, he was very forward thinking for his time. Like he was really like on the cutting edge of civil rights, very, very big on all these things that today we would say, oh yeah, that's the right thing. Especially for a guy in 1880, but it just, somebody shot him because he didn't become ambassador to France, so it's the way history turns.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sure.
Crazy stuff like that.
Yeah.
Woo. Okay. So let's jump ahead a little bit. How you kind of mentioned like Trump not having a pet right now. How important is it for it's when they're considering what pets to get, like the type of breed and like the image that the animal brings? Is that something that you think is given a lot of thought?
I don't know. I don't know from an image standpoint. I mean, Elizabeth Warren's golden retriever is named Bailey after George Bailey from It's a Wonderful Life. And to me, that's the most on-brand Elizabeth Warren thing you could do. Like he's a banker, but he's in favor of this little guy. And, like that's Elizabeth Warren, So that, and I'm not saying that that's entirely calculated. It just seems very on-brand. I know with the Obamas, when they were getting a pet, I believe it was Barack Obama who had allergies, or was it one of the girls? Somebody in the family had allergies to dog dander, and so they needed a breed that wouldn't cause those allergies to flare up, and that's how they came to the Portuguese water dog. Ted Kennedy had some, and
Ted Kennedy.
He gave them
I think it was
Bo.
a gift. Yeah,
Bo was a gift from Ted Kennedy because he said, okay, these are hypoallergenic dogs, and they're great dogs. Kennedy would go running with his every day. And so that's where that came from. So, sometimes there are other considerations in play. And like Bill was saying, a lot of the pets turn out to be gifts in some way or another. I know Nixon, a couple of the dogs had been given to him by admirers. I think Ronald Reagan had been given some dogs as well, and they were sent out to his ranch in California. People have tried to give Trump dogs, but
and Pushinka,
yeah,
that's an interesting story.
Yeah, Pushinka was a gift to Jack Kennedy from Nikita Khrushchev, and that sounds really crazy, but the way that worked out, excuse me, I guess I should take a sip of water here. Hold on a second.
Go ahead.
So in June of 1961, Kennedy and Khrushchev were having a summit in Vienna. And they, when you have these summits, it takes multiple days and you always have these big formal state dinners. And Jackie Kennedy was seated next to Nikita Khrushchev at the state dinner. John F. Kennedy was seated somewhere else. The two guys didn't want to talk at that point, probably. So they're just chatting, making small talk. And Nikita Khrushchev starts talking about the space dogs, Belka and Strelka. They were the first dogs sent into orbit. They had orbited the Earth and been returned safely. Prior to that, the Soviets had sent a dog up into space, but they couldn't get him back, so the dog just died up there. But Belka and Strelka came back to Earth, and then Strelka had puppies. And he mentioned that, and Jackie Kennedy said, "Oh, you'll have to send me one of the puppies." And, she forgot all about it because it was just small talk. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, this dog shows up at the White House with a little Russian passport. And, it's a gift from Khrushchev to Jackie Kennedy. And the FBI had to come in. The Secret Service had to check it out, no bugs, there are no electronic listening devices planted in this dog's rectum or anything like that. And,
oh, my gosh.
The Kennedys got to keep the dog. And Pushinka ended up having puppies with one of Kennedy's other dogs, a dog named Charlie. And so it's like a little Cold War love story. And I did write a children's book about that one too. My thought and some of the reading that I've done on this, and again, it's a very subtle thing. It's not the kind of thing that is really overt. But one of the theories about why the Americans and the Soviets were able to back down during the Cuban Missile Crisis is because they had this backdoor channel for exchanging gifts, and they had exchanged gifts with each other. Kennedy had sent Khrushchev in response to Pushinka. He had sent him like a little like ship in a bottle or something. And when you're able to see the humanity of your adversary, I think that makes it a lot harder to push a red button that nukes that person's country. And it allowed them to work together because they had this back channel, they also had a way of communicating that could go beyond just what the media or whatever the normal modes of communicating. And that was really helpful. They were able to kind of circumvent their military establishments, all of whom were advocating for some sort of confrontation in Cuba. Yeah. So I think of Pushinka, in some ways as like a dog who saved the world. I mean, that's the closest we've ever come to nuclear war. And, in a very small way, maybe in the same way that like having a rescue dog might push somebody over the edge into making a decision in the voting booth, just like, the last straw on a big pile of decision-making ideas. I think Pushinka had some impact there.
They can become ambassadors. I mean, these dogs, pets, are so important for a lot of people who like them. And when they get into a situation like that, look how that possibly bridged two world leaders that were headed for confrontation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if maybe like Kim Jong-un would send Donald Trump a dog or something. But Trump has said he's not a dog person, so maybe that would actually be the wrong thing to do. I don't know what Trump should send Kim Jong-un, but
a rocket?
No,
I didn't mean it like
far,
that.
Too far.
Like calls him Little Rocket Man.
Yeah. Maybe send Elton John to do a concert there.
There you go.
That'll have less. It'll seem less aggressive. Sending him a rocket's kind of like if you found a bullet in your mailbox. Like, oh crap, somebody's coming for me.
Somebody wants me.
Yeah.
Oh man.
We haven't had that.
No. But we do get people commenting sometimes, like they're so vehemently against, for instance, Bill Clinton or Donald Trump. We've gotten probably hate mail on both. I recall the Bill Clinton one.
Yeah, it's not really hate mail towards us so much as it's just like they're really angry about. I mean, I think on Facebook I had shared a picture of Bill Clinton walking a dog, and some lady like private messaged us and was like, "This is a despicable human being. How dare you share this picture?" And I'm like, all right, look,
He's walking his dog, and this was every president.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, I think there are things you could point at, and I'll throw my political stuff out here a little bit. Like, I'm liberal. I think Bill's more conservative. Like, our museum kind of like spans all of that stuff. But I understand, like, there are things you can look at Bill Clinton and you can say, like, as policy aside, this person has done some questionable things, and I understand being upset by that. But at the same time, it's just a guy and his dog.
He's just walking his dog. It really shows the human side of people having a dog, and I think that's what helps politicians, especially presidents. But I mean, he was just walking his dog after his presidency in New York, I guess, where his home is, and the woman went off. I mean, she had a couple of choice emails to send to us.
Yeah, and and it's the same. It's the same thing with Trump. If Trump were to get a pet, let's say he got a cat or something. I don't know why. I don't think he's going to, but let's say he did, and we posted a picture of that, which of course we would, because that's us. We're the Presidential Pet Museum. We'd get angry, comments like, and it's just
people get bent out of shape for everything. But I did see Donald Trump. I don't know if anyone else saw this on an interview or a question someone threw at him. Are you getting a dog? And he said no. He said, "Can you imagine me walking a dog?" That's all he said. And I'm like, oh gosh. Well,
and even as somebody who disagrees with Trump politically, I do think this is one area where I give him some credit for knowing his limitations in that regard. Like, I'm not a dog person. I'm not going to do this just to, look like I am something I'm not. So why do it?
The thought was that for his son, he might.
Oh, yeah, for Barron.
And of course, it does personalize you some, humanize you, whatever.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're not a dog person, you get one for your kid. He would end up with bad PR, because he'd end up like with pictures where he looks angry at the dog for doing something, and then that would be the
then he'd have PETA after him.
Yeah, really.
I mean, it's just at a certain point, when you're the president, 50% of the people are going to be pissed at you all the time. It doesn't matter. You know, so you can do something that seems really innocuous. Like when Michelle Obama said, like, I think kids should eat more vegetables. And conservative people were like, don't tell my kid he can't have a cookie. Like, what?
Yeah.
You know, like you were just probably telling your kid to eat vegetables before they had a cookie. You know, it's just one of those things. Sometimes you can't win.
Yeah.
At Warriors, everybody's got an opinion and thinks they're an expert on something. And
Yeah. Well, and you guys are in an interesting spot because you're just trying to report on, share something fun and lighthearted, you know, presidential pets, but it's, you know, the president's such a dividing topic sometimes, you know, so you guys kind of get caught in the middle of that. I can understand.
Yeah, that's
especially in today's day and age. Years ago, of course, there wasn't all this, I guess, divisiveness, whatever you want to call it. And it was probably a little easier, especially when Claire was doing this. But he was told you the story, I remember, about Lucky, where she took the dog hair and they made paintings. And I think they auctioned off some of the stuff. I remember her telling us that when Reagan got word of it, or somebody in his administration, they actually did charity events with some of the dog hair that they were auctioning off. I don't know if they were making them into any kind of art or just auctioning the dog hair off, but there was some stories about that. So,
I mean, yeah, there was a time when things were less divisive. And to reference another history book that I read recently, there's a book called These Truths by a woman named Jill Lepore, who writes for The New Yorker. And she talks about how when you had, before cable television, when you just had 3 networks, people would watch the evening news because it was the only thing you could watch at 6:30. And so everybody was more informed, and they were all sort of informed in the same way. And once cable came in, I mean, then people, like some people broke off to like Fox News and MSNBC to more politicized things. And other people just started tuning to TBS to watch reruns of Roseanne. And so you sort of lost that moderate voter. And you, in a way, that takes away some of that cohesiveness, because the moderate voter now is much less informed than they used to be until right before the election. And then what do they get informed by? They're getting informed by, you know, attack ads and, you know, all these different things that are just kind of thrown out there. They don't have
in a
the
hurry
base
to get the vote.
Yeah, they don't have the base knowledge to build upon in a way that people in the 60s or early 70s would have had. And not that there weren't divisive things then. I mean, obviously Richard Nixon was very divisive. You know, the war in Vietnam was very divisive. But there was a time when Lyndon Johnson got reelected, he won by such a landslide that people thought like the country was just going to be democratic for like the next 50 years. And then, of course, in 1968, Richard Nixon wins. I mean, it was just something happened there. The war, and between the war and the civil rights movement and all these things that kind of shook loose in society, you know, things cracked open. And, you know, now here we are. And I'm not saying we should go back to before 1965. I don't want to do that. But it would be nice if, you know, we were less divided politically, if we saw a way to work across the aisle with each other. And I think cable news and Twitter and Facebook kind of hurt that. I think it makes it so easy for us all to just hear like one side of the story because we select what our news input is, and then to make that decision and to vilify someone else for disagreeing with us even a little bit. You know, even if they're on our same side, generally speaking, like, well, on this issue, you weren't liberal or conservative enough, so you should be primaried, and we should just, you know, there's this push for purity now that I don't think is constructive in a democracy.
Yeah, well, that's something that, you know, Twitter and Facebook are having to deal with, where, you know, they're, I don't know how, like, where they are on it now, but their algorithms are sort of set up to, you know, feed you more information of the stuff that you're already looking at. So your biases just get fed and fed. So you just see more of the same stuff, where you're not seeing, you know, both sides anymore.
And it builds your paranoia, you know.
Totally.
And, you know, all of these things, like it just makes you so that you really. I used to watch cable news, and I realized after a while, like, this just makes me angry. You know, like, why am I doing this to myself? Why am I making myself angry over something that won't even be in my mind next week? Like, there's an issue of the day. It's the thing everybody's ticked off about right now. And next week, it will all have totally forgotten it.
New flavor, something new next week.
Yeah, it's just an outrage factory.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. No, this is getting far more political than the Pet Museum usually does. You know.
Yeah, we really make it a point to not, and again, animals are a great way to bridge gaps, and us being on sometimes different ends of the spectrum on our political views, helps us, and it shows how we get along. We don't have to argue about politics all day. Unfortunately, too many people are, and like you said, you get the social media craze where I think they feed into it too. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what's great about your site and what you guys do too is you have such a log. You have every single president and you have their list of pets,
yeah,
Mhm.
and you could go back and see, George Washington's pets that he had, or, maybe more work animals or whatever. But
Yeah.
but
that's the fun
exactly.
part is it humanizes everybody, all the presidents of
Well,
history,
even presidents that I hate, like I think Andrew Johnson, if he's not the worst president, he's probably like the second worst. Like it's a real race to the bottom between him and James Buchanan. But I love the story of Andrew Johnson and his mice. Like while he was being impeached, there were these mice coming into his bedroom in the White House. His daughter wanted to have them exterminated, and he said no, and he would feed them flour. He would like put flour out for the mice. And I just picture this like racist old drunk that everybody in DC hated who's about to lose his job, and his only friends are these tiny little mice. And it, like it it doesn't make me really like him more, but it kind of like adds a little shade of complexity to my feelings about Andrew Johnson, and there was some debate as to whether those should actually count as pets. I count them as pets. If you're feeding them and like that's, you don't just feed random animals. That's your pet.
we have a picture, press photo. We got a lot of press photos for the museum that we hope to share in when we get a more permanent home. But in this photo, it shows Richard Nixon the night before he was going to resign the presidency, and he's comforted with his dog on the lounge chair wherever he's sitting. And you can see all on his face the stress and everything going on, but you can see him taking comfort at the same time with his dog. So it's kind of interesting. So that's maybe the same dynamic was going on with the mice.
Yeah, I mean it's very poignant. Like the Nixon photograph is very poignant to me. I mean, and again, there's somebody that I think he should have resigned based on the things that he was doing, but you can't help but feel for the guy and to think for a moment about how hard it would be to make that decision. You fought your whole life to become president. Everything you've done has been, I'm going to get to this place and I'm going to like run this country. And then it all crumbles, and you've got to leave, and you're the first president ever to have to resign because you're going to be impeached. Like your party has come to you and said, we cannot support you. And the strain and, just realizing that you are now going to be infamous in that way and kind of dealing with all of those emotions and to put that together with a dog, and to have the dog be a comfort to you. I mean, I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, it's pretty deep. It is pretty deep.
Go ahead.
One of the presidents, I forget who, said if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. Who was that?
That's attributed to Harry Truman, which is interesting because Harry Truman was given a dog and he was like, I don't want this dog, and he gave it away. And so then people were mad. They were like, he was getting hate mail like, how dare you give away, the dog's name was Feller, like Feller, on our site, it's like Feller the unwanted dog. And so then he got another dog that he like gave to his daughter or something, like, all right, Margaret can have a dog, but yeah, Truman, for being the person who says that, I mean, I guess he didn't want any friends in Washington. And by the end of his term, he was pretty unpopular. Excuse me. We look at him today and we say, well, Harry Truman, he did a lot of good things. It was really important that he did this and this. I mean, he desegregated the army. There were a lot of things that Truman did that would push him up the rankings for me. But when he left office, he was seen as, very unpopular, like a failure. He's sort of the patron saint for that now. Like anybody who's losing a presidential campaign thinks they're going to be Harry Truman. And anybody who is, really hated when they leave office, they think they're going to be Harry Truman in 50 years. So, he's a good example.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up, we talked about it before, but how so many of these animals, these pets, are given as gifts. And like when I was going through your site, it's amazing. I had no idea that political leaders were giving each other animals so often. And it's such a strange gift to receive, I feel like, from someone, like another political leader or anybody. It's like, well, you don't want to be rude and not accept an animal or give it away, but it's tough to bring in a new animal, especially the White House.
that's a commitment, man. I mean,
That's,
like,
Yeah.
it's, big decision, and they're giving them away like nothing.
oh yeah, and now we advise people like don't give people
Right.
like animals for gifts because
We're worried it's a commitment,
yeah,
a
like
dog lifelong commitment or an animal lifelong
yeah,
commitment.
like even the singer Sia has a song called "Puppies Are Forever," and it's on
Right.
her Christmas album. It's about like don't give your kid puppies because
Yeah.
puppies are forever.
Yeah.
But yeah, people used to just give animals, and if you've seen The King and I mean, there's the famous part where the King of Siam wants to send elephants to Abraham Lincoln. Like, oh, they can help you in your war against the South. I mean, can you picture like William Sherman riding the back of an elephant, as he's stomping through Atlanta? It's kind of awesome, actually, but like I don't think Lincoln's response was, I don't believe the elephants are really suited for our terrain and our climate.
Yeah. Well
It's very
said.
different from Siam or modern day Thailand. So he turned that down, but. Yeah, like people were Harvey Firestone, I think, gave a hippo to Calvin Coolidge. Like why would you give someone a hippo?
Yeah,
Like
like
They had so many pets, the Coolidges.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
I mean, like the hippo is the most dangerous animal in Africa. You're going to give it to somebody, like as a
They're
present.
trying
like,
to give him a
you know,
sign, like
yeah.
like sending him.
Yeah,
a
I don't
rocket.
like your economic policies. Like here, have this hippo. The Coolidges did not bring the hippo to the White House. They immediately said, like, we'll send that to the National Zoo, thank you, and it became very popular there. But it was Billy Coolidge.
Really?
Um,
That was the hippo.
yeah,
Billy
that was the
Coolidge.
hippo.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we have a representation of him in the museum, stuffed animal.
Yeah, we just have a stuffed hippo. We don't actually have a hippo. That would be, maybe in the
Little
future,
hard to
Bill. You could,
maintain.
yeah.
We'll put a moat around the museum where we put
okay, so that makes the point that I'm curious.
Yeah. Well, now I know what to get you for Christmas.
There you go.
A hippo.
That's funny.
So I'm curious about do you guys know who is like when a dog comes into the White House or any animal really, like Trump said he's not a dog guy, he's not going to be seen walking to dogs really or anything like that. Like who is caring for these animals? And we had the previous owner of the Presidential Pet Museum was the groomer, right? But like
Right.
is there photos of presidents picking up dog poop off the front lawn?
I think there's one of Obama or Clinton doing that. I'm almost sure.
Possibly,
We have
yeah.
a picture.
I haven't seen that, but then I haven't seen all the press photos you have. I'm legally blind, by the way. My guide dog's sitting down here, so
Yeah.
so I don't always see all the press photos that Bill has. Like I try to look at them, but details aren't my thing in that regard. But I do know that from my research in Pushchinka that for many years, from the Eisenhower years up through I believe it was Nixon, the early days of the Nixon administration, there was a guy named Travis Bryant who was an electrician in the White House, and he ended up getting tasked with taking care of the animals around the White House. So he would take care of the Kennedy dogs. He took care of Johnson's dogs. He like did stuff for Nixon as well. He wrote a book called Dog Days in the White House, which is significant in covering a lot of those animal stories, but also was one of the first books to really put out juicy, gossipy details about Kennedy's sex life. So, it came out in the 70s and was like this big deal. I think now it's remembered less for the pet stuff and more for the Kennedy gossip. But, that was a helpful resource when I was going through it. And I would imagine that generally speaking, there's some White House staffer who's tasked with regular maintenance. I mean, not that, I don't know for certain, but let's say the Obamas. I can see Michelle Obama assigning the kids like, okay, you're going to feed Bo and Sonny. I can see that being a chore that Malia and Sasha would have had to do. I don't know that for certain, but it seems like the kind of thing that if you're raising kids in the White House and you have animals, you would give them some responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're just, like the Eisenhowers were both like older when they were in the White House. They weren't. I don't see Ike getting down with a dog kibble and feeding his dogs. And he had been a general. He was used to people doing things for him. I think that would have just been a natural thing to have this guy Travis Bryant come and do your your regular dog maintenance.
Well, Clara told us that when she would go to groom the dogs, it was in like a shed that you wouldn't imagine would be on the White House grounds. It was just like kind of the way I was envisioning it was this dark and dingy shed that you'd find somewhere on an abandoned property. Like I might see on the trail going down.
So something out of Texas Chainsaw
Yeah.
Massacre. They're like just there in the White House, you know.
And yeah, maybe they were trying to keep her away from the main area, or of course they didn't want the dog hair, and I'm sure all the
You don't want the
dander
dog
and
hair in the
everything
East
all
Room.
over.
Yeah.
But yeah, she said it was just they put her out there to do them.
I mean, that, you know, in a way that makes sense. You want an area for somebody who's coming in, an outside specialist, you want an area where they're not going to have to go through all of the levels of security. I mean, obviously there's going to be security if you're getting onto the grounds at all, but you don't want them to have to go through the same kind of stuff as somebody who's going into the family quarters of the White House.
Yep, right, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember if she had told us who gave her the dog. I'm sure it wasn't Ronald or Nancy Reagan that handed her the dog to groom. It was one of the handlers, like we were talking about. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure someone there.
Yeah. At the very least, you have an intern, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you send an intern out with the dog, go get this groomed, you know.
Fun.
Yeah, man, I love these stories. This is cool.
Good.
So
Glad you're enjoying it.
Oh yeah, this is great, man. So where's the so what's up with the your museum today? Is it, I think I read it was under renovation?
I don't know if I would say renovation.
Well, you might have read an earlier piece because Claire had it listed for a while as being under renovation. Originally, it started off in her house, and now it lives in a warehouse pretty much. We're in Baltimore, and we actually set up kind of a nice display. It's the size of a small room, and we have some stuff displayed there. It's way too small for all the artifacts and photos and everything we have. We're hoping to rehome it somewhere in the Washington corridor area, Washington, D.C. corridor, but we haven't been able to do it yet.
Yeah, so when people ask me, you know, can I tour the museum, I basically say we're still looking for a permanent home. And I would love to see that soon. We've had some debates about like making part of the museum mobile versus, you know, other ways of doing it. And it's just really trying to find the best way to get this information out there and to do it in a way that's manageable without, you know, Bill having to hire 50 people or, you know. We just recently did a show, APAC, I forget what it was called again. It was APIC. I'm not entirely sure what that stands for. It was a political memorabilia convention that I went to. And, you know, we took some of the artifacts. We took Pauline Wayne's cowbell and the stuffed hippo. And, you know, it was fun. Like, people would stop by and I would tell them stories about the pets. And, you know, I was with another guy who works for the museum on occasion, and he went around, he was looking at all the buttons, and he ended up finding these postcards of William Howard Taft and his mascot, Billy Possum. And I had never heard this story. But Billy Possum apparently was supposed to replace the teddy bear because the teddy bear was named after Theodore Roosevelt. I believe the story was something like Roosevelt was going to shoot this bear, and then he for some reason he decided not to, and he I don't know, the bear was just so majestic he couldn't shoot it, and he didn't, and then they named teddy bears after him, and it was this noble thing. And then William Howard Taft one night ate a 16-pound possum and said it tasted good. So then people were like, his supporters were like, we're going to replace the teddy bear with the Billy Possum. And, you know, it never caught on because, like, one, the story isn't as good. Like, like not shooting this noble, majestic beast is kind of like impressive. And you know, like there's something really dynamic about that. And then when you talk about, I ate a giant possum, you know, that's just not as heartwarming. And then also, you know, teddy bears are cute, and like, what's your stuffed possum look like? Apparently there were postcards that would show like Billy Possum eating a teddy bear, and then the guy at the next table at this conference said, "Oh, I have a postcard at home that's a teddy bear eating a possum." I guess like it must have been for when Roosevelt ran again in 1912 for the Bull Moose campaign. You know, his supporters were trying to like reclaim the teddy bear's supremacy or something. It didn't help Taft that his economy tanked, and then Billy Possum sales really fell off. But there were even like songs and stuff, you know, like Billy Possum songs. And I had no idea of this till we found those postcards.
Yeah, we didn't know of this history.
I mean, because that's not really a pet, but it's sort of pet adjacent. You know, like you're talking about like a president and his animals and how people use animals to promote what they're doing. And yeah, it's just really fascinating. I mean, like the only other you've got the teddy bear, Billy Possum, and then the only other time I can think of an animal being directly associated with a specific presidential candidate and as a symbol like that would be Andrew Jackson and the jackass, which is where we get the modern donkey for the Democratic Party.
Oh, okay.
Because his supporters were jackasses, and then they just like owned it. And
Yeah.
they were
You
like,
said that, not me. No.
yeah, well, no, well, I mean, honestly, I don't really care much for Jackson, but that's what the opposition, like Henry Clay's people, would have been saying, or John Quincy Adams' people would have been saying, and so they just owned it and became donkeys, and that's the symbol of the Democratic Party today, which is kind of weird, but all right.
Yeah, man, I didn't know that. That's a cool story. And then did Andrew Jackson have like a swearing parrot too?
Yes, he had a parrot that was swearing. I think it even swore at his funeral, if I'm remembering correctly.
Right.
Like they brought I don't know why you bring the parrot to the funeral, but like, well, he misses Andrew as well. He wants to say goodbye to old Hickory, and he does, like with some colorful language. And it's not reported what the parrot actually said. I would love to know. I'm sure by today's standards, the curses were probably very mild. I doubt it was dropping F-bombs, all over the place, but. You're talking a time when like saying damn or hell or bastard would have been this like giant scandal in, the 1830s or so. I mean, but that's pretty funny. I mean, it kind of and there's an example where an animal, a pet, tells you something very specific about the president, because Jackson was known for being very, very rugged, very frontiersman. He wasn't genteel. He wasn't a patrician like John Quincy Adams, so having a swearing parrot, like I said with Elizabeth Warren and her George Bailey dog, this is totally on brand for Andrew Jackson. I mean, this is right where he should be.
Mm-hmm.
When you said, I know we talked about it yesterday, but when you said about the parrot was at the funeral, when I came up with that Sardar, who was who was the Kennedy's horse that was at the White House, came to Kennedy's funeral, and they did a riderless horse. I don't know if it was Sardar or not,
no,
but
I don't
Sardar
think that
was definitely there, and
So Sardar was actually another gift from another world leader. I believe it was the president of Pakistan.
Right.
Jackie Kennedy had toured the Middle East at a certain point, and he gave her this horse as a gift. And there was some issue as to whether it would get through customs, and she called her husband and was like, this horse, I need this horse now. I don't want it waiting 6 months for quarantine or whatever. And he had to pull strings, and it actually went to the floor of Congress briefly.
Did it
like
really?
Somebody brought up a bill to like condemn the president for rushing this horse through customs, and they just quashed that. It's kind of like, all right, like, listen, let's let's not be that petty.
Right. So did they have? So that horse was actually on the White House grounds?
Yes, they did have some horses on the White House grounds, although they also owned an estate in Northern Virginia, I think outside of Alexandria. I'm not entirely sure the location, but most of their horses were kept permanently outside of D.C. Now, there are pictures of some of the horses on the White House grounds, and obviously the dogs were there, but mostly the horses stayed because Jackie could go riding in Northern Virginia. I mean, they had like hundreds of acres, so she could ride around there without the security issues of, riding your horse through the district,
Yeah.
Yeah. I like the, just to imagine the juxtaposition too of like, the president in the Oval Office and, all these offices and everything going around in the White House, but then there's like, a squirrel running around, or there's mice in there and stuff. I love that. That's so hilarious to me.
Well,
it is.
And I think one of the interesting things that I'd never really thought about, but there were various points in our history where the White House was really run down. And, so yeah, you get the mice. I mean, now they would have those mice removed right away. I mean, that's not even a question. But there were times when the White House was really in bad shape. And so, it wasn't that big a deal.
Wasn't there a fire there?
The British burned it down in 1814, I want to say.
But more recently, because in the museum, we came across a piece, an artifact that is before the White House was remodeled. I thought maybe it doesn't say after the fire. There's a piece of wood from the floor. It's documented, but And that's actual artifact that we got from somewhere.
I don't think there was I don't think there was a second fire, but they have remodeled at various points. I mean, Jackie Kennedy did a big remodel
along those lines.
You know, she made a big deal of going through and finding antique artifacts or things related to the White House that had been there 100 or 150 years before her and brought them back. And like, that was a minor controversy because she was spending so much money to do this renovation. And then Mary Lincoln before her had done similar things. And that was a big controversy because that was during the Civil War when you're raising taxes and, you know, you're trying to figure out how to feed all of these hundreds of thousands of troops. And she's going to New York and buying $20,000 worth of drapes. It's a, you know, kind of an issue for Abraham Lincoln, but, you know, Lincoln's one of those people who probably really benefited from not having 24-hour news coverage because I love Lincoln. I think he's the best president of all time, but there's a lot of stuff where, oh man, you would get crucified if you did that now. I mean, and some of it's like war related, like the habeas corpus stuff, like he had to imprison people so that Maryland didn't secede. But then, yeah, stuff like his wife spending with the drapes, or there were, you know, like other kind of weird scandals like that with people in his cabinet. And, you know, you just didn't have the news cycle to, you know, really amplify that. And, yeah.
You get away with it. You know?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So did things ever get, you know, out of hand at the White House? Because, like, when I go through and look at the site, some presidents had a lot of pets. Was there a time, and I think even Calvin Coolidge, you said he literally had a zoo, right?
He did.
Yeah. I mean, it was pretty close. And Teddy Roosevelt had more than Coolidge.
Did he really?
Yeah. Oh. I mean, Roosevelt had the most of all the animals. The Economist actually took our website and they made a little bar graph, and then there was like Teddy Roosevelt was like way out there, and then Coolidge was close, and then everybody else is like, you know, 4 or 5. I would say Teddy Roosevelt's the closest to getting out of hand, just in the sense that like he had young kids at the White House as well. There was a point where one of his kids, you know, they took a horse upstairs on the elevator. His daughter used to have a green snake named Emily Spinach. It was named after one of her aunts, apparently. And she would kind of keep it up her sleeve, and like it would come out at like state dinners and crawl around on the table and freak people out. One of the Roosevelt kids had purchased some snakes at a local pet store and came bursting into a cabinet meeting, you know, like carrying these snakes and freaking out all the cabinet members or the people who were present. I would say that's the closest it came. And Teddy Roosevelt, in part because Teddy Roosevelt was so indulgent, although Lincoln was also indulgent. And I think the goats that he had, Tad would hook the goats up to like a chair or something, and the goats would pull the chair through the, like they were having a banquet one night, and like the goat came barging in, pulling this chair with Tad on it. And, you know, Lincoln thought this was all in good fun. But of course, you know, like Andrew Jackson, in some ways, he was very rugged and frontiersman. A frontiersman. He was very rugged and not very prim and proper. So that was all cool with him. But, you know, his Tony Washingtonian guests were not impressed with the goats. So
did Roosevelt have bears at the White House? Wasn't there a story and the Congress voted to make him put him in the zoo?
You're thinking of Martin Van Buren and the tigers.
Okay.
Van Buren was given tiger cubs.
Okay,
and
that's right. The tiger
He was
cubs.
keeping those in the East Room at the White House until Congress.
Oh my gosh.
Congress was more powerful in those days. I mean, now our executive seems to be the most powerful of the 3 branches. In those days, it was the legislature, and they made him take the tigers to the zoo. They're, you know, because imagine being an opposing congressman. You come to, you know, like, well, sir, let me take you to the East Room for a moment. You know, like, just go on in there and wait for me. I'll be it. You know,
hold your arm out.
Yeah, hold this raw meat. So, yeah, that's one of the stories. Jefferson had some grizzly bears on the White House lawn for a time.
That's who I was thinking. Jefferson.
They were sent back, I believe, by the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he kept them caged there for a little while.
But people were complaining.
Yeah, he did eventually move them. I don't know if it was at the behest of Congress or if it was just they started off as cubs, I think, and they were getting bigger. And grizzlies are pretty large. Jefferson also had an issue that would probably ruin any president today, where a ram or a sheep on the White House grounds killed a child. Like, this child, in those days, you could just like walk through the property. The kid was like trying to just take a shortcut through the White House grounds to get to the other street, and this ram headbutted him, and the kid died. And
Wow.
I mean, if you can imagine a president being even tangentially responsible for the death of a child on White House property today, I mean that would be the end right there. There's no coming back from that. But that was, I think that tells you something about the nature of the times as well. I mean, people would have 10 or 12 kids because only so many of them made it to adulthood for one reason or another. And, death was more, especially the death of children, was much more part of regular life back then in the early 1800s. So much of what we've done with medicine and science is to eliminate that particular thing, like the death of children. And, I think a lot of those animal regulations we were talking about earlier kind of goes along the same lines. You can't have a pet monkey because we don't want your monkey to eat this child. So it's, it was very different.
Well, that's where it's fun is you get the older presidents that had they had tiger cubs, crazy stuff that just wouldn't happen today. So that's what I love, that you guys are sharing that and documenting that stuff. Man, this was great. So where can you guys have the presidentialpetmuseum.com. That's your official site. There's a bunch of information on there. It's so fun to go look through that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then Andrew, do you mentioned that you had some children's books that you'd written off of these pet stories. Are those available anywhere?
Yes, we've started a series. It's called POTUS Pets. We have 2 books so far. There's a third one probably coming out later this year. And they're both available on Amazon. One is called Old Ike. It's about Woodrow Wilson's tobacco chewing ram. And the other one is called Pushinka. Both of them are available on Amazon. Old Ike actually is available on Kindle for 99 cents. So, that's a good one to get out there. And if you want to try it out, I would say they're probably geared mostly for 4th through 6th grade, but I've had younger kids like it, and I've had adults who've told me oh, I really like that. It was so interesting. But if you've got a kid who's interested in animals or presidents, and they're kind of in that age range, late elementary school through middle school, that's kind of the sweet spot. So, it's worth taking a look at. And what I tried to do was, when I was a kid, I used to read these books we were there at the Battle of the Alamo, and it would be the Alamo, but through the eyes of children that were, supposedly present. And what I've done is kind of the same thing. You're seeing a lot of this history, but it's kind of because the dog or the ram is there. And, it kind of allows you to work your way into some of these ideas and these historical notions, with the animal being, kind of our audience surrogate, really.
So, yeah, they sound awesome. I want to read them right now.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
We should send you a copy.
Sure.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Man, well, this is good. Anywhere else we should send people to learn more? Can we visit the museum today?
You can't visit the museum today because we're still looking for that permanent home. But we're hoping that'll be soon. And let's see, there's presidentialpets.com.
Presidential Pet Museum.
Presidentialpetmuseum.com. Yes, let me make sure we get that correct. Presidentialpetmuseum.com. I don't know what's at presidentialpets.com. Maybe it's awesome, but that's not us. Do you want to? There's woofdriver.com.
Yeah. If they
right?
want to know anything about what I do on a more personal level, woofdriver.com, WOOF driver.com, and that's all about dog adventuring, and I'm into huskies, and actually a couple presidents have had huskies. Well, I know Reagan had a husky on his ranch at least.
Yeah, that's the one that comes to mind. I know we have a picture of Harding with some huskies because he had traveled to Alaska shortly before his death. He actually died on the return trip home from that. I know there's at least someone else. I've looked at these things so many times, but the 44 presidents sometimes start to run together if there's not a really strong all pets have personality, but we don't always see that because the clippings might just say oh, and his Belgian Shepherd, whatever, and they don't really give you more information. So sometimes there are animals like that kind of fall through the cracks a little bit because the press just didn't report on them as much.
Yeah, it's wasn't a big story back then, whatever. But yeah, woofdriver.com, they can find out more about me, and it all ties together through Wolf Driver, Presidential Pet Museum, and all that good stuff.
Sweet.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Well, yeah, I'll have links to all that stuff so people can check it out. And yeah, definitely encourage everybody to look into this stuff because it's just a fun part of our history, and I'm glad you guys are sharing it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having us on to talk about it. It feels great to have a conversation with somebody and just sort of, because when you tell people what you do and you say, I'm a historian at the Presidential Pet Museum, they're always like, first of all, they say, is that really a thing? And then, but then they're always interested. So it's nice to kind of have this platform to get out there and reach, thousands and thousands of people with this idea, because I'm sure lots of people are curious.
Oh yeah. Yeah, well, and I mean, I wish you guys the best of luck in, finding a new location and continuing to grow this. It's awesome.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much.
Yes, well, thanks, guys. Thank you, Bill, Andrew. Have a good one, all right?
You too. Great talking to you.
You too.